So this is slightly different. I'm not quite a macroeconomist. So my name is Julia Steinberger. I'm at the universities of Lausanne mostly and Leeds still a little bit. So a lot of the research that I'll be showing you tonight happened at the University of Leeds and funded by the Leverhulme Trust. So I'll go right into it and we'll have a discussion later. So the topic is living well within limits, planetary limits. Is it possible and what will it take? And I'm actually going to start my talk with the end, or with a provocation, which is, what are you going to do? Because I've been giving these talks for a while, and people, on Zoom a lot, and people tend to ask, oh, well, what about this, what about that, what are you going to do? No, the question is, what are you going to do? There's 100 of you in this room, and we are facing the most crucial years that humanity has ever faced. So I want everybody to rethink your job description. And honestly, this is a big challenge for your community. It's a big challenge for everybody's community. Don't take it personally. But I think that we're really at, I don't know, calling it a crossroad is a bit too polite. We're facing a cataclysmic disaster. And what we do in the next coming years will determine how the magnitude of that disaster. We can still reduce that magnitude significantly. But this requires everybody to sort of rethink what they're doing and change their frame of operation. My challenge to you all is that in a few years, you're going to generally be ashamed and disappointed in yourselves if you are not going to start to be brave now. So the colorful bit of the slide is my assessment that our governments and our economies are pushing us exactly in the wrong direction, and that we, if we want to change that, really have to step up and be part of transforming this. And that includes things like activism. It's not just governments and policymakers that are at COP, it's also activists and social movements. So it involves being part of a whole society and a whole democracy if we want to take this seriously. In my view, the urgency of the climate situation does not allow for gradual transition in research or in reality. It really calls for radical transformation. And my perception of this is that the popular movements, including the student strikes, the Sunrise Movement in the US, Extinction Rebellion, all have understood the scale and magnitude and scope of the challenge a lot better than the research community. So my question to all of you, to myself included, is our research supporting them, and how can we contribute and participate? So I'll tell you a little bit, tiny little bit, because the previous speaker actually did a lot more in terms of the climate context. I'll tell you a bit about my research and its implications. So the climate context, as we all know, is one of accelerating disasters. This is a picture that was taken last year close to where I live, actually in France, but close to Switzerland in the French Alps, where the little town of Vésubie was pretty much devastated by a flash flood, and this is also very near to Germany as well. So what is our current situation? We are doing this. Can you see the mouse? Yes, you can. Great. It's like a pointer. So we have left the Holocene. So for me, this is one of the single most scary slides in the history of ever. The Holocene temperature range is really, really narrow. It's sort of 1 degree, plus or minus 0.5 degrees. Well, minus 0.25 and plus 0.75 here. So within 1 degree Celsius for the past 12,000 years, since the last ice age, that's this little narrow, clement, stable, warmish temperature range where our species developed agriculture, cities, and writing, anything you might call civilization. And we left it maybe within the last 5 years. It's a very, very, very bad idea to leave the Holocene, but it is now in our rearview mirror. We are up at, so in 2020, the temperature that was measured was 1.2 degrees, so already very, very far advanced in the direction of 1.5. And we're advancing at a rate, roughly, the slope on this plot, you can basically read it off the chart, it's basically 0.5 degree per decade. That is our current trajectory in terms of our current level of emissions. It could get worse, of course, if our emissions increase. And our emissions, in order to avoid the worst, need to do this. They basically need to fall off a cliff starting now, or preferably yesterday. So how do we deal with that? One of the ways we have to deal with that is we have to understand the historical roots of our problem. So one question we can ask ourselves is, who could have possibly known what present we are living in? So who could have possibly known what future they were pushing us into? This plot is become slightly infamous. I don't know if it's the first time you're seeing it or not. But it shows, it's a little bit complicated. It has two vertical axes. So the vertical axis on the left-hand side is carbon dioxide parts per million. And on the right-hand side, it's average temperature increase. So this is a plot made by somebody who really understood that pushing a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere would result in a large temperature increase, right? And they show it very clearly. This plot was made in the early 80s. So the person who made it was living around this time. And they pretty much nailed the concentration of CO2 that we had in 2020. Their temperature increase was a bit too optimistic. They thought it would be less warm, but in fact, of course, it was more warm than they did. And of course, this was an internal report, not published, but written by Exxon. It was not published because published has the sense of public in it. Like you publish something to make it public. Of course, this was not made public. This was kept secret. This was an internal report. They did not share it with their stakeholders, with their shareholders, with the governments, or their customers. In fact, right around this time, not only Exxon, but a lot of the fossil fuel industry shifted from climate science, which they had been actually pouring millions of dollars into, sending expeditions to the polar regions and so on to observe whether or not climate change was really happening. They shut down their climate science programs, including the climate scientists who produced this plot, and put all of those millions and then some into disinformation, denial, and delay. Including lobbying and corrupting whatever democratic processes we have. So we are in the present and the future, this very, very dangerous state of time, that a certain industry and a certain sector, a very large sector of our economy has pushed us into. And there's also a question of responsibility and accountability here that I think we have to take very seriously. What are the implications for research? We need urgent and large-scale action, radical emissions reductions, getting close to zero within the next couple of decades. And the fastest and surest way to do that is to reduce consumption, which is degrowth, by the way. Reducing consumption doesn't require as much, we'll talk about that in a bit, new technology or infrastructure. But to date, up until recently, there's been very little research into how consumption could be reduced while preserving or even enhancing well-being. So this question of reducing consumption while increasing social welfare is the core one in my research. And the lack of this research caused people in the climate domain like Kevin Anderson, who's quite outspoken, to say basically we haven't even tried mitigation yet. We don't even know what it would look like, because that's the kind of thing it would look like. So we saw the need for a new analytic framework. So this is a very interdisciplinary project. So it's the Living Well Within Limits project that I lead. And this is what our framework looks like. It's got biophysical inputs, planetary processes, natural resources, that kind of thing on one side of it. It's got social outcomes on the other side, including needs satisfiers and well-being. We'll talk about that, what that means a bit. And in the middle is this interesting thing. These are integrated physical and social provisioning systems. So the object of study of heterodox economics, which is relevant to this conference, obviously. So we're trying to understand what provisioning systems, what the economy would look like that would have the provisioning systems that would enable us to reduce energy use, to reduce resource use, and have high well-being. So effectively, one of the things we're asking ourselves is, if it's possible to live within limits, we're basically talking about doing something very close to testing Kate Raworth's donut that she put forward in Donut Economics, in her book Donut Economics, which is shown here. And so this idea of testing the donut is something that we did as part of an early stage of the project. So if you haven't ever seen this before, this idea of the donut is that you have an external circle of planetary boundaries, where it's a very bad idea to be past those planetary boundaries, but it's also very bad to fall within this circle where you have social deprivation. So what you want is you want to have good social conditions and not destroy the planet at the same time. Can we do it? And the national results are shown here. So we did it for a whole bunch of countries. And you can see that Germany is doing terrible. So that's all the red stuff for Germany is doing terrible for a lot of planetary boundaries. We're just showing like stepped over, right? We're not even showing like it can go much further out. By the way, this data includes, this is all footprint data, which was not shown before. So it includes the trade implications of Germany. So Germany, like pretty much all other European countries, is dependent on trade, and its emissions and land use, et cetera, impacts are much higher due to its trade relations than they would be just if you look domestically. However, Germany is doing pretty good on the social foundations. In fact, I think it achieves either all or most of them. Whereas a country like Sri Lanka does the reverse, basically, right? It doesn't go over its social planetary boundaries, but it also has a lot of social shortfall. You see the red inside the circle, inside the inner circle there. And this is actually normal. So if you look at all countries in the world, what we're doing here is very simple. Every time a country transgresses a planetary boundary, we tick it up on the horizontal axis, we tick it up by one slot. Every time it achieves a social threshold, we do the same on the vertical axis. And what you can see is that Sri Lanka has a neighborhood, other countries near it, not doing so great on the social thresholds, but also not transgressing planetary boundaries. Germany also has a neighborhood. It's doing pretty well on social thresholds, pretty terrible on biophysical boundaries. And there's also the worst of both worlds is entirely possible to inhabit it. That's a neighborhood where you also have lots of neighbors, so doing bad on social thresholds and on the planetary boundaries. And the neighborhood that is totally empty is where we need to be. It is a very lonely place indeed. There is nobody there. And so the question becomes, okay, how do we go from here to there? We're all, when Kate Raworth saw this plot, she said, we're all developing countries now, because we all need to move radically into different directions. And that becomes the research question. How do we help inform what that transformation looks like? Because things are obviously not great. So, answer to the question, is it possible to live well within limits? No, not in current international reality. That's really depressing. We're all going to go off and have drinks afterwards. But we don't stay there. Okay, so we try to find out how to get inside Kate Raworth's donut, and I'll give you an answer in 3 parts, or at least an investigation in 3 parts. So part 1 is equity and distribution. And obviously, when we're looking at national averages, we're giving a lot of charity, right? We're basically messing things up, because within those national averages, there's going to be deprivation and overconsumption, right? So we need to somehow dig deeper and understand what distribution and equity are doing in there. This is a fantastic plot. So there was a really, really great chapter in last year's emissions gap report on inequality, where you can see this huge distribution. So the top 1% here, you can see the sort of impact and emissions that they have in terms of CO2. And then you have the top 10%, the middle, which includes the top 1%, obviously, middle 40%, and bottom 50%. And what that corresponds to in terms of global contribution to annual CO2 emissions is that, and so this is now not national, this is now within countries, right? We're diving into the individuals and households most responsible, is that the emissions from the top 1% correspond to 15% of annual emissions, which is more than twice of the emissions from the bottom 50%. That's a hugely criminal level of inequality. Well, of course, it mimics international income inequality very closely. The top 10% are responsible for roughly 50% of global emissions. This result and others, well, the timing is a bit wrong, but basically this kind of perspective caused us to write a paper that received a lot of attention, possibly because we tried to put the message in the title, Scientists Warning on Affluence, basically trying to make the case that there's a very strong scientific basis for seeing wealth accumulation as a threat to human society, basically, let's put it that way, in lots of different ways, and including macroeconomic power relations. So maybe that's an interesting thing to discuss. We also did an article where we looked at basically what inequality means in terms of products. So we're not just looking at income versus emissions. In this case, we're looking at energy use, and we're looking at energy use per consumption category. So this is our study was published last year in Nature Energy. The BBC related it as climate change, the rich are to blame, which is fine. But the main thing is that we looked at, what I really like to draw out here is that we looked at categories of products. So we were able to drill down into what products are used by who around the world. And we were able to map these product categories. And so we mapped them by, elasticity, which is, I don't need the clock. Yeah. So we mapped them by elasticity on the vertical axis. So consumed disproportionately by poor households is lower down. Consumed disproportionately by rich households is further up. More or less energy intensity on the horizontal axis. Now check out this quadrant. Hey, and we had no presuppositions about what we would find, right? Just throw the data in there. And so check out what's in the luxury and high intensity corner. It's all transport categories. Every single transport category is in there, and pretty much the only thing in there are transport categories. So transport is the thing that is overconsumed by rich people, that is high energy intensity, high resource use, high emissions. Whereas in contrast, basic but high intensity is heat and electricity, it's energy used in dwellings. So we have this real spread in our consumption between transport and dwellings. And that's really important to understand. So this is a problem you do not grow your way out of, this transport problem. You really have to go towards taxation and regulation, which is one of the things that was discussed in the previous talk as well. And if you're clever, you would invest that revenue, because the other thing is that the households who are spending, the low-income households who are spending all of their money on heat and electricity in dwellings do not have the financial capacity to invest in retrofit, right? So most people do not, or low energy, renewable energy generation, et cetera. So you really have a much more fine-grained resolution in terms of understanding what inequality is doing there. So that would be something that might be interesting. Because I'm in Germany, I'm not going to let this go. Cars are a huge problem, and huge cars are a huge problem, okay? So this is basically the contribution to carbon emissions increase in the last decade. And you can see that the largest, this is a study from the International Energy Agency, you can see that power, which is electricity, is a huge chunk, right? The biggest chunk, you might expect that. The next one is just sports utility vehicles. Just large cars destroying the planet for no good reason. They are not necessary, they are deadly, they are dumb. Okay? All other cars are actually going down. It's shocking. We're really sort of driving the planet off a cliff. These are unnecessary emissions. There was no need for this to happen. It's just a complete, we actually know kind of why it's happening. We kind of know what has pushed the car industry into this direction. It's declining profit rates and a move towards financialization. But it's a really bad development regardless. Anyway, so Tim Gore says we need to regulate the heck out of this, and we should reinvest revenue in other good stuff. And he is right. We also did a study on redistribution. I'm not going to go into it here, but basically one of the reasons why redistribution would be beneficial is because you move from transport energy use, which is hard to decarbonize, to dwelling energy use, which is better for people who need it, who are poorer, and also easier to decarbonize. So if you want to check it out, why we came up with that argument, Yannick Oswald wrote about it in the conversation. Okay, second part, how to get into Kate Raworth's donut. Socioeconomic factors. So not just inequality now, other socioeconomic factors as well, but probably inequality is going to show up again. It's a really big one. So this is a study that involves a little bit of mathematics. So just hold on to your socks, or whatever. So the first thing we're doing is we're using this analytic framework I showed you at the beginning, and we're looking at energy on the one hand and need satisfaction on the other. Okay, good. That's two variables. So we're starting with this bivariate relationship. But then we're going to complicate things a little bit, and we're going to throw in some parameters related to sort of the macroeconomy, to this sort of macro provisioning setup that we're within. And so that gives you a third variable, right? So that's your sort of provisioning system variable. And then, just because Yefim Fogel, who's the lead author on this, is extremely clever, we come up with an interaction term, and that gives us domains of validity and all kinds of it gives us a better understanding of what we're actually doing within this space. And what we're doing graphically is much easier. So this again is, energy use versus human needs satisfaction. No, I don't need to know the time. Thank you. And we have these provisioning factors in the middle. The bivariate relationship looks something like this. A beneficial provisioning factor would moderate this effect, and it would basically move this curve up. It would allow societies to achieve higher well-being at lower energy use, whereas a detrimental provisioning factor in red would drag it down and make it harder to achieve well-being at a given level of energy use. And we're basically able to map these out. So long story short, we basically identify which provisioning factors have positive effects and which have negative effects. Positive is green, negative is red. All right, so it's very simple. Okay, so lots of green ones. Public service quality, public health coverage, trade transport infrastructure, electricity access is massive. Access to clean fuels, massive. Urban population is a bit positive. Income equality, massively positive. Democratic quality, massively positive. Trade penetration, foreign direct investment, it's a wash, didn't really matter. Negative factors, extractivism, so an economy that is reliant on extractive activities, that is hugely negative, it really shows up. And economic growth past a moderate income is hugely negative. So that tells us something in terms of if we're thinking about these policy directions, it tells us a bit about what kinds of societies have the preconditions that enable well-being at lower energy use. So that might be something interesting to think about. There's a third part to the answer, so how do we get inside Kate Raworth's donut, which has to do with sufficiency and efficiency modeling. So we're basically trying to make a model of what the world could look like. So far we've just been observing what it does look like, and see what that, see what this different future could look like. So we're modeling a different future based on the decent living energy framework of Professor Narasimha Rao, who's at Yale. This framework connects needs satisfaction so human well-being to sufficient levels of energy services. We construct a global model, takes into account every country in the world, including technology improvements. We're having equal distribution, and it results in lower energy demands levels. The model looks a bit, this is actually literally what the model looks like, kind of. You start with your decent living standards. You basically give people the energy services required for all of these different things that are satisfied through personal consumption, various, things, including appliances and vehicles and whatever. Some of these have direct energy, some of these have embodied energy. We can take all of that into account. Public consumption, schools, hospitals, and so on, private consumption, and infrastructure. So we take all of this stuff together. And in terms of the energy service level per person, this is sort of what it looks like. It doesn't look luxurious at all, but it doesn't look like something where people will suffer from harm through deprivation. That's the main goal. And it takes into account lots of things like demography and climate, including warming, etc. The results are in final energy use. So you can see these on the vertical axis. Here we have some International Energy Agency references. So let's say around 2020, we were at 400 exajoules and a bit. Probably, there was a previous low energy demand scenario that ended up at 250-ish exajoules. Our model ends up at 150. So decent, we can estimate in an ideal, equitable, high-tech world, sufficient world, that decent living energy for all, every single man, woman, child, anybody on planet Earth, achievable at 40% of current energy use despite population growth. So that's interesting. So, to the answer, is it possible to live well within limits? We can add another answer, which is yes, but only through a complete transformation of our economic systems towards equity, sufficiency, and maximal efficiency. So, extremely different world. I always end my talks with this point, which is that I really do not believe that our governments and economic structures, capitalism in some places, other structures in other places, are conducive to allowing us to make the changes that need to happen. So I think that it is well past time for scientists and researchers and people who have the privilege to be able to think about this kind of stuff for a living to take action and to stand with activists who are putting everything on the line in order to change the systems we have. So I completely agree with Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldly that the scientists who alerted the world to the climate and ecological crises have a moral duty to join the popular movements demanding political action. I am part of the people who are trying to help think through what that looks like. We recently published an article called From Publications to Public Actions. Get it? Hilarious. In trying to change the role of the universities and what academia looks like, give us tenure for spending a few days in jail, that kind of thing. We're going to get there. And the other thing to pay attention to is the fact that environmental protest is really being criminalized around the world in very, very harsh ways. So this is also something that where we really need to stand with our civil society. So for a while, our governments and the powers that be were able to say, nobody cares about climate and ecological stuff. That's why we can't act on it. Well, now that children are in the streets in their millions, and people are in the streets in their millions and doing nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, now they're just putting them in jail. So it's not about public attention, it's not about public demand, it's really a power struggle, and we have to think about where we stand in that power struggle. So thank you very much.